Okay, so by welcome everyone, good afternoon. By way of background to what brought us here today, a group of interested women, mainly women from the 51% coalition, have been having discussions about how we are seeing this present moment, how we could possibly impact the conditions on the ground, particularly in terms of the state's behavior at this time. And one of the things that we agreed was needed was spaces in which there could be some conversation around the realities that we are facing. So that this is one of a number of sessions that we hope to have that are going to be dealing issues as we see them emerging. We're interested in looking at health and human rights, labor rights conditions, rural women in agriculture, and you'll be seeing similar invitations from us in the weeks to come. We thought that a panel on the economy was an important starting point because, as you all know, coronavirus is not simply a health issue. It is also an issue that is going to impact us. Well, it is impacting us in terms of our economic conditions, but also in the long run. And that as Jamaica and other Caribbean countries are vulnerable, we think it's important for us to have spaces in which we can share and interrogate ideas. And the economy, we want to move away from the idea that the economy is something, or economics is something that is premised in esoteric knowledge, so that it is a space in which we can think through people's lives. We are all in some way participants in economics. We are laborers. We are using resources, the environment, or time. We are budgeting in the household. And so in that, and we are also impacted by the decisions that are made nationally and globally. And so we thought it important to have spaces in which we could be sharing knowledge that hopefully can have some bearing on how we advocate in our local and collective spaces moving from here. So our first speakers, I want to introduce them, are Dr. Mariama Williams and Dr. Michael Witter, both of whom may be already known to people in the room, so to speak. But Dr. Mariama Williams is doing work. She's the coordinator on sustainable development, climate change, and gender at the South Center. And she has published on development, gender equality, women's empowerment, social equality, and international trade, external debt, and finance. She's a feminist economist, and we think that's very important because, as you know, women are at the center of the impact of coronavirus, and we believe that we need to think through the location of women in order to think about how our societies could look different. She has a forthcoming publication, Climate Trade and Gender Nexus, which will be published by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Dr. Michael Witter is a former head of the Department of Economics and a senior lecturer who also served at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at UWI-Mona. His research focuses on the green economy, the informal economy, the effects of neoliberalism on small island states, and economic development more broadly. In addition to Dr. Witter's academic work, he has also served in an advisory capacity in relation to the Jamaican government. And I want to speak to him about the period of the 1970s more specifically when we get into it. So by way of managing, I want to ask that everyone keep their computers, phones on mute until you are speaking. There is going to be a Q&A, but you can also send questions in the chat that we might be able to address in the course of the questions that I'm going to pose for Dr. Williams and Dr. Witter. To begin, I want to ask them both to address the question of how they are seeing the present moment in terms of where we are at in the Jamaican and broader Caribbean economy. Dr. Williams, do you want to lead?
Not necessarily. I think Mikey should go ahead and start. I'd like Mikey to start.
All right, Dr. Witter.
Okay, well, how do you do, everybody? Glad to see some familiar faces, and for those of you who I'm not seeing, welcome to the reasoning. We're really just starting a process to try to be inclusive. And today I'm going to dedicate my participation to one of the Caribbean's foremost economists, foremost political economists, foremost thinker, Professor Carrie Levitt, who is not so well right now, and hope that this puts a smile on our face. I welcome this. This seems to me to be, one of several reasonings that are going on, and I'm hoping that this becomes more inclusive. Mm-hmm. At the present, of course, the Caribbean economy, and Jamaica in particular, is like the rest of the world in a serious slump, as you can imagine. And as elsewhere, that slump has revealed the inequalities and associated with that, the vulnerabilities of the population. It's very striking that what you see on the global level, where the poorer countries are being hit really hard economically, though not as hard in terms of health-wise, at least as far as we know now. One of the questions we have to pay attention to is, why is it that the Caribbean is doing so relatively well with regard to infections from COVID? Well, that's a subsidiary matter. But certainly the economies have been hit very hard. To take the case of Jamaica, it is quite extreme, as you know. There is not a single tourist on the island, and the other third of our foreign exchange, another third of our foreign exchange comes from remittances, and the remitters, our brothers and sisters abroad, are poor, so they'll have to cut back. Bauxite is down. Almost everything you can imagine is down. So, and the prospects of this kind of recovery coming are not very great. So, at this point in time, it seems to me that the good side of this, the opportunity here, is to rethink where we are, with a view to maybe thinking more of an economy that is resilient, rather than the focus that we have had for the last 40 years of an economy that is to be growing, and see growth as an aspect of resilience, and not merely ignored in favor of growth. So where we are right now is an economy that, the formal economy is basically in pretty bad shape. I imagine a lot of the survival activities, particularly in the agrarian sector, is continuing, but even them, you must remember always that informal economy is dependent upon the formal economy also, so that with the collapse of spending power, farmers can be producing, but really not much getting sold, but at least they have something to eat. So we're in a situation where the society, and the economy in particular, has to reach back for all of its survival techniques that it has accumulated over the years, and we are facing a very uncertain future. An uncertain future that involves not only this, but several waves of pandemics to come. Right behind it is climate change, and all the risks that we have had hitherto of political backlash for things that we do that displease those who have power internationally. All of those things now combine to provide an even riskier international economic environment. And therefore, the challenge of being resilient is not only more urgent, but is also very much more difficult to achieve at this present time. I think that's how I would sum it up. We can go in many directions from there.
before we move on to Dr. Williams, can you speak a little bit more about what you are seeing in terms of this the relationship between resilience and growth?
Well, I don't think that the growth pattern that we have followed from before independence and since independence, that is now, we're talking now at 70 years, has had resilience as a central feature of the growth strategy. In fact, our growth, whether it has been successful or not, our growth strategies, whether they've been successful or not, have always led to increased inequality. So when the growth levels were high in the 50s and first part of the 60s, inequality was growing. When the growth level is down, we are squeezing the working people in order to get growth, so the inequality increases. So growth is associated with inequality. I'm suggesting to you that the resilience in terms of the capacity of the society and the people in the society to bounce back depends upon addressing their vulnerability. And that vulnerability has to do with their marginal returns that they get from the economic activity. Many of us are poor, and a whole lot more people are just above the poverty line, so that the slightest shaking, they fall below the poverty line. So I'm suggesting that we need economic growth, but it must be economic growth that is inclusive. I made a point used to when I was teaching to my students that we can get 5–10% growth next year. All we have to do is put everybody back in slavery. If we all agree to go back in slavery, we can get rapid growth. But the implicit notion is that we would like to grow as free citizens with our dignity respected and so on. And therefore, we have to find a way to come up with growth that is inclusive of the majority and at the expense of the majority of the population. And in that sense, I think that kind of growth will support resilience, I think.
All right, we'll come back to the idea of the relationship between inequality and growth, but Dr. Williams, we want to hear from you.
This evening. I think Dr. Witter has really summarize the key points of this discussion, right? Because this pandemic, global pandemic, as everybody's recognizes, is not just a health crisis. It actually is an economic crisis, and it will generate tremendous rebound effect and all across the world, which will have triple and quadruple effect on us who are out in the periphery, dependent on one or more item tourism, the remittances, all of those things are set to be in a downward trend. I think what is important is that we understand that we are in a unprecedented time and we need unconditional responses. I think almost every economist is talking about that. The new chief economist for the World Bank, started her inaugural speech by saying that globalization is been routed, it's over, which is quite a powerful statement coming from the World Bank. I think that's reflective of everybody that we are on a global pause. It's a pause for nature. It's a pause for each of us to think about what is important in our lives and what is important around us, and also what are the defining features of the economy that we want to live in, and what should the economy be doing, and how should it take care of those who are the most vulnerable amongst us. There's a chance for us to reset and rethink even the one thing that carries the economy, tourism, to think about tourism in a different way. And I think it's a chance that if we can seize it, and that's why these kind of global reflective or regional or national reflective conversation is important. Because if we leave it to politicians, they will do, what is instinctively for them, which is to try to get the economy started in the best way they know how, or the tools that they have existing. But those tools cannot carry us very far. And so unless we put the most vulnerable in the society at the pinnacle of where we move and how we move, we're not going to be able to move far. And we're not going to use this moment And I suspect that we are not going back to some kind of normal, which is about resetting growth. The global economy itself has collapsed. I mean, if you look around, the trading partners that we depend on, US, Germany, all of those, when they start back and open up, it will take significant amount of time to generate any amount of export earnings from them, because they themselves are under serious manners, as we would say, in many respects, right? So their population are dependent on, are counting on the government to subsidize them and so forth. So we have to really think about how we use this moment strategically and tactically to develop the kinds of things that we have been talking about for many years, and how we are able to influence and discuss with our politicians and our parliamentarians and our MPs how each community can benefit and can utilize whatever the government and the business community can pull together. And so the government, as with most governments, have taken the similar steps, right? So they've done the containment, the social distancing, and all of those are good. Some people have issues about it, but the net result of that is that economies have collapsed, right? Because we're in most cases, unless you're a huge, massive economy such as the US, and even there's significant sectors of the economy that is not producing anything. And our economy is much less. As Mikey said, that tourism has collapsed. Most of the activities that generate income for those at the bottom are dwindling, and the opportunities are dwindling. The kind of fiscal stimulus that the government has put in place really, I think, has dried up. It has reached the bottom. It was never very effective, very adequate. It was good. It's a good thing to do, but it was not adequate. It was all about the taxes. And so now we need to see spending that really is about building community and moving into community, and spending that is not constrained, because the government seemed to be, I mean, they were very quick to develop stimulus program. I will definitely give that. But they're also constrained by keeping an eye on not doing anything to make the deficit seem problematic, and not doing anything to change what they see as being their good behavior with the IMF and the international financial institutions. Now, you cannot govern an economy by trying to be cautious about fiscal deficit in a crisis where you need expansive fiscal policy and expansive monetary policy if you really want to reach and to regird the economy, because your deficit is dependent on the activity. And right now, the activity has to be domestic generated activity, what's going on. It will take a while for tourism to rebound, right? It will take a while for remittance. If we're counting a remittance, remember that many of our people that live in the US and Canada the good thing is that many of them are in the health sector, right? And the health sector is one of the thriving sectors. The most thriving, of course, is the digital, Zoom and those other kind of economy. So most of our people in the US and Canada are in health sector who have regularized income. But many of them are also low wage earners who are dependent on a good economy, a rising boat, to be able to send remittances. So I think we will see some drop off in remittances. I don't know how much, because I haven't looked at any numbers, but just from talking to people and seeing what is going on in the US with people who are low wage worker, even up to moderate income worker, who are struggling now with insurance. I have teachers and so forth struggling with insurance payment, mortgage payment, and various kinds of things, and haven't worked. And even the unemployment benefit that was promised is not necessarily flowing as much as it was thought. So remittances, the things that we usually count on in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, remittances kept our economies afloat. We cannot count on that necessarily anymore. It will take a while, and our people are very good, and they love to take care of their family, and they will try their darndest, but they themselves are going to be struggling for a while, as their economies, wherever they are, except for maybe Canada, where I think the government there is really putting good policies in to try to make income go to the bottom and to the lower income. That's not something that you see in the US and the UK and other places where a lot of our remittances come from. So I think we have to be more than ever self-reliant. and more than ever taking care of each other, and more than ever making sure that the communities that are vulnerable have the resources that they need. And those are your three sets of actors that can do that. The government, in terms of increasing spending, the business sector, in terms of figuring out ways that they can continue to pay workers, ways that they can use the tax credit or various kind of things that the government give them in a way to stimulate the economy and help their workers, and us as citizens in terms of how we move and how we take care of each other. So I think it's an unprecedented time. I mean, I can't think of a time in my lifetime where global economy had come to a standstill. I've not verified this, but I'm told that 4 flights a day come into Geneva. One from UK, one from Germany, one from another place. That is astounding, right? And France is still locked down. A lot of countries are still locked down. So we need to see how it is that we can protect the most vulnerable in our society so that our society can thrive and people can become resilient. Because we know that when the crisis started, even though if you look at the IMF statistics, they said Jamaica was in a very good macroeconomic and fiscal state. But the fact is, your last quarter GDP growth was slowing tremendously. So you already went into COVID in an adverse situation, which would only get worse. So, and I think that it really must put really a lot of pressure on each of us to do our best and push the government to do more fiscal expenditure spending that will stabilize unemployment, take care of those at the bottom whose income are informal and aren't systematically able to take care of themselves, so that we can have a stable society. Yeah. So that's what I would say to start with.
All right, we have a lot to think about. I want to pick up on the self-reliance theme, and Mikey, I want to draw on your experience here in the 1970s. So you worked with the Mandela government in the 70s and were a part of the group of the so-called TAM crew of Norman Gervin, Louis Lindsay, George Beckford, who were trying to push the government to think about the economy and economics in terms of the ordinary Jamaican. And following on the economic crisis of the mid-1970s, you embarked on the process of developing the emergency production plan, which was never implemented. The government chose the IMF route instead. So we are, since that period into the present, fully into the neoliberal period. How would you think about the lessons of that period and managing crisis? Does it relate to our present? Yeah. You are muted, Mikey.
Well, there are similarities and differences. Most important, the international context. In the 1970s, we were disconnected because we were out of alignment with those who held power in the global economy. No, the whole global economy has collapsed. That's a very big difference. The net effect is that we are still disconnected. And our disconnection seems to me to be more severe because our dependency has increased. So while we learn the lesson that of the vulnerability of being so dependent on exports and imports, and particularly imports of food and energy in the 1970s, we allowed ourselves to believe that we could ignore this and that there would always be a global economy, and that somehow if we followed the external prescriptions, we would be able to access this global economy. Well, the global economy has collapsed. And the impact on us is probably going to be greater than it was in the 1970s. So I think that that's an important distinction. On the one hand, it does mean, however, that maybe there is an even greater space for rethinking how we negotiate the international economy, how we arrange our affairs now, since we really not likely to have the big powers looking over our shoulders the way in which that they did then. Certainly the biggest of the powers don't seem to be interested in anyone else but themselves. So there's a little bit more space here, I think, than there was then. Nevertheless, in doing some work recently, I ran across a talk Michael Manley gave in 1970. He came to power in 1972. In 1970, he was pointing out the problem of dependency, the need to help our farmers to go into agro-industry. Those were very clear problems recognized, certainly, at the end of the 1960s. At the end of the 1960s, when the second five-year plan was written, the plan was replete with concern about the shortage of foreign exchange that was arising because the bauxite cycle of investment had come to an end, so that there was going to be a serious foreign exchange crisis. Well, we have a foreign exchange crisis now. It's just that we prefer not to address the foreign exchange shortage, but to leave it to so-called impersonal forces in the market, which has now driven up the exchange rate to 150 to 1. And that really just means that those who don't have access to the US dollars and those who are economically weak are going to hurt all the more as a result of the same problem that was identified then. In the 1970s, the important thing that we tried to do was to mobilize what people thought they could do with the resources that they recognized they had in their communities. A piece of land, old marble mine, any kind of resources that people saw in a way to try to pull them together to begin to address the needs starting at the level of the community. And in the preparation of the emergency production plan, there was a massive campaign to get people to suggest what could be done to get us out of the economic crisis of the early 1970s. I recall secretaries at the Ministry of Agriculture bringing their children to work who were sleeping on the floor beside them so that they could do the process of planning and collecting information. I think we collected in a pre-digital, in a pre-cell phone, pre-computer, pre-social media era, something like 10,000 suggestions coming from ordinary Jamaicans. That, I think, is perhaps going to be one of the most important lessons going forward. Namely, we now have much more ability to reach out and to pull ideas and suggestions and new thinking from persons who don't have access to power, persons who are normally voiceless in the society. And it is all the more important to do that now, because in the 1970s, what we had was a cadre of economists, social scientists, thinkers, journalists, young politicians, teachers, professionals, labor leaders who were confident people. They were willing to chart a path for their society. I'm afraid that in recent years, many of our academics have lost that confidence. They don't believe that to start with thinking about the economy, the first thing they have to go and look and see what the IMF and the World Bank is saying. They cannot conceive of anything outside of those kinds of views anymore. And so I think that the leadership that that process of popular mobilization of ideas got from progressive professionals, progressive political politicians, is not likely to be around now, which means that it's all the more important that we try to find ways to include the voices of the voiceless. Now, we have developed techniques here of public consultation, which essentially stifles the voices of the public. You bring them into a cold hotel room with an agenda and a speaker who you have to give thanks to and those kinds of things. And it intimidates the ordinary people. We have to find modalities to be able to tap into people's ideas where they are. And so I think that that is one of the important lessons of the 1970s that we need to come back to and try to get, as Mariama suggested, the state, the private businesses and civil society to participate in this process. I am sure that the private business is looking every way possible now to see how they can have people work at home and reduce their overhead costs at work. I am very clear that the modality of operating in business is going to be different. Similarly, if government is really thinking about anything more than the next election 1 year away, then they will be thinking of ways in which they can use the modern technology and communication techniques to improve governance, to make governance more inclusive. And civil society, although it has been decimated by the same kind of economic process that we have been alluding to, I think it's an opportunity to get them to mobilize them again with some public support, obviously, in order to facilitate this this putting together of people's ideas of what can be done, how the resources of the country can be used, how we can reduce waste. We are fortunate, for example, that energy prices are down now. In the 1970s, it was food and energy prices going up that triggered the problem. Now we have low energy prices. Food prices have just about started to move now, but we have no income because the tourism income is gone, bauxite income is gone, and remittances income is gone. So we are in exactly the same kind of position now. At that time, we thought that the way to do it would be to try to manage the demand for things with energy, manage that needed energy, managing demand for food by replacing as much of the imported food as what we could produce locally. It seems to me those are obvious things that are going to have to come back now. The way in which we do it now obviously is going to be different than the way in which we tried to do it in the 1970s. And it is up to the merchants today, the young farmers today to think through what are the things that can be done. Recently, there have been a series of articles in the newspaper by Donovan Stanbury, who used to be Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture, very informative about the areas that can facilitate import substitution. And the truth of the matter is that there are less areas so obvious now than there were in the 1970s. We have become far more dependent on foreign food. So to me, 1970s offered an opportunity of developing a strategy for economic development. And I think this moment again also allows that. One last example. We knew in 1977, we knew in 1977 that we were addicted to wheat. We knew that. We knew we'd never be able to grow wheat in Jamaica, and people want them flour. So we said, look, traditionally, what the farmers do, small farmers do, is they border their little plots with sweet potato plants. If we could get them to grow sweet potato, get sweet potato flour, and blend sweet potato flour with imported wheat flour, say this year and for the next 2-3 years, 1% sweet potato with 99% wheat. Then for the next 2-3 years after that, 2% sweet potato with 98% wheat. Over 30 years, you would have reduced the import content of wheat of our diet relatively, while producing a market for farmers by developing the sweet potato flour from sweet potato. Now that's a simple example. You can think of many other things like that. But what I wanted to point out to you is that this was a strategic perspective that said 30 years from now, we must be less dependent on imported wheat. 30 years from now, we must have a multilingual population. 30 years from now, and we began to think in those kinds of terms. I believe that this is a moment again when we need to do that. But the voices of the young people who will be alive 30 years from now, they are the ones who need to say what they think is important 30 years from now. My generation has said what it has said, and we can be a resource to the younger generation. But they have to ask themselves, what will they do to manage climate change? What will they do to manage the recurring pandemics over the next 30 years? How will they deal with the dependence on imported food? How will they deal with the dependence on imported energy? How can the education process be developed to equip them better to participate in the global economy from their yards? Just like what the BPO people are going to do now is to manipulate them and force them to use their yards as workplaces. So in those kinds of ways, I see similarities with the 1970s. But we must always recognize that there are profound differences, and while the problems remain the same, the solutions may not be exactly the same.
I want to refer to a comment here by Michael Heslop, where he's suggesting that essentially it's the dependent relationship that Jamaica has with the global economy that is a stable problem, and that changing the domestic context requires radically transforming from the bottom up. And on that note, Mariana, I wonder if you can speak to your perspective on change as a feminist economist, thinking through feminism and also the location of women who are, significant contributors to the Jamaican and Caribbean economy, and also are significantly dislocated in this process.
Well, I think one of the dimensions of this pandemic slash economic crisis, of course, is the gender dimension, in the sense that in most places, and I don't think Jamaica is peculiar in that our frontline workers and the so-called essential workers, our nurses, teachers, and domestic workers, and all of the women who have to be taken care of. Now they're doing triple and double burdens, having to take care of themselves, families, and communities. So that there is a serious thing. Some people are referring to it as a she recession, whereas the 2008, 2009 was a he recession. So the thing that's happening now in terms of bringing to the forefront who are your critical and your essential workers in the economy, how do you treat them, how are you going to work with them to enable them to be able to progress and to become even more resilient than they are, because they're resilient, but they're not infinitely elastic, right? So that they're at break points. So we need to do that. So we have to also change conception about who is taking care of children, how are children being reared, even when schools are closed, women are taking care of children, they're doing teaching duties, they're doing nursing duties, they're doing all those kinds of things. So that's one dimension, right? That the policy itself also has to take care of that. When you're doing your fiscal stimulus, it's not simply about the GCT reduction, it's not simply about giving tax credit to MSMEs. It's also about how do you do social reproduction, how do you do childcare, how do you do teaching, and how do you reform teaching, and how do you make those critical elements of the economy. That's one. The other thing I think is that we should be past the point where we're looking at binaries, just the health sector or the water sector. All of the sectors now need to work together because they're cross-sector and intersectoral dynamics. So all of the ministries then need to start working together, and we need to go out into the communities, I think, and see how communities are surviving, which is the starting point, I think, for like the People's Plan and so forth, is that communities, even under this is one of the hardest crises I think that we've come across. But communities have always somehow been able to survive by pulling together their resources. We have to go back to some of the issues about, Mikey talk about import substitution. We're in a very real situation where people are putting constraints on their exports, right? So many of our trading partners will be putting constraints on export of food. They're already putting them on export of certain kinds of medicine. So all the things that they told us that we couldn't do and we shouldn't do, export control and so forth, they are now having to implement that. And I think you're going to find that the more that the production facilities that produce meat and dairy and chicken in the US is compromised, is the less that they're going to be able to export to us, which means that we have to go back to basic with our farmers, with all of the imported things that we have in all our supermarkets, and we have to work with our farmers and our informal sector workers to get people the materials that they need to help them to devise and to be creative about the resources in their community. So I think we need to do some mapping also of this COVID to see how communities are surviving, right? Because people are definitely surviving. They certainly cannot survive on the 9,000 Jamaican dollars for 3 months. They'll need money beyond that. So how are people surviving? That kind of mapping, I think, needs to do to how what the farmers need to enable them to be productive in certain sectors that they might have abandoned. And how can we support that? And how can we then also look for more sustainable markets, market niche, that might be possible. We've been tied to exporting specific things. I think the fact that oil prices have dropped gives some room for the government to be able to have, even if it has a small tax on some kind of oil, it can have some revenue that it can then redirect into subsidizing MSMEs, subsidizing informal sector workers. Again, many of them are predominantly women and women with children. So I think a lot of this is about creatively rethinking the economy. And there's no map, there's no blueprint that's going to be delivered to us, because all of the economies are struggling about how they're going to reboot their economy and start it over. And I don't think that there is a normal that we're going to return to and it's business as usual, though we will try, because we tend to want to go to the easiest possible thing. I think this crisis is different from the 2008 crisis, right? Where you had sectoral issues. Here you have lockdown in production. You have cross sectors where people aren't producing goods and services. We will see trade is suffering, and we'll see even more of it where people we buy rice from, we buy all kinds of commodity from. As their population need it, they will put up export controls, more and more of those export controls, and we will have to struggle to find. And within the region, how do we all export? I mean, the Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, tourism, right? Tourism is declining. The World Tourism Authority says if the lockdown continues beyond July, 57% decline in tourism. If it continues to September, 73% decline in tourism. And beyond that, collapse, total collapse. And not just the collapse, but the possibility to recover will not be, in some statistics, the recovery will not happen till end of 21, 22, right? So we're looking at very serious times. And we then need to now begin to look at how, with what we have, we can support the people from the bottom, those who are producing, those who are the informal sector worker that don't have the luxury of leave, sick leaves, or any of those kinds of things, how we can utilize, and when I say we, right, I mean, in fact, the government can utilize fiscal policy to support and to enable sustainable livelihood and to enable resilience of the community. Because remember, no, this is what? May. In 2-3 months, we're in hurricane season, all right? So then you will have concurrent possibility of natural disaster with COVID, all right? And it's not unusual, we see it. Croatia had it. I think Indonesia. There are a couple of places where we have, even the US, the tornadoes concurrent with COVID, which means that the problem of what the solutions for solving COVID, you cannot do anymore, social distancing and so forth. Some countries in Africa and Asia, of course, cannot do social distancing. All right, people live in poverty, live right close to each other. There's no social distancing that will work. But in our case, we have to think ahead about how it is that we're going to deal with a hurricane season that is supposed to be coming on strong, concurrent with any potential rebound after, because we're locked down is June, July, and you're in the middle of that one hurricane, and what happens, right? So we have to begin to gird up the system, be able to build into communities as much as we can with all the resources we have, and that has to be the focus. It has to be single-minded focus. You cannot have one eye on the IMF and one eye on the fiscal deficit and one eye on looking good and do this thing. You have to focus yourself, really. The global economy, even the IMF know that they have to let go of their traditional things, because they have to bolster Europe, they have to bolster everybody. So it's up to us to demand what we need for our economy, to define what are the critical elements and who it is that we need to support, and how we get that support and move in that direction. And the rest of the global economy will move along. Because they themselves are struggling. They're pretty much also lost too, because they're stuck with the same old tools that they've been using. The thing is that they have deeper resources than us. I always laugh and tell people that Switzerland have so much stolen money, and no matter how much fiscal stimulus they use, they'll never run out of it, because they have all the stolen money that's in the bank and from all of the dictators of the world. So they don't have any problems with going back into the pot for fiscal stimulus. We on the other hand, we are constrained. We know that. But we still have wiggle room within our fiscal apparatus to be able to move to meeting the needs of the most less fortunate among us, to reburn our agricultural sector, to promote kind of shelter and various kind of things that we need. And we need government to move as one, all of the ministries to move as one and in tandem. And we need the private sector to recognize and not just that when they, even if they get tax break, they must use those tax break to buffer their employees and buffer the system of production. And as Mikey's saying, that they will definitely try to keep people at home because, of course, they now learn that you can produce. And in fact, we tend to be even more productive when we're at home. I certainly am more productive at home than I was in the office because going back from one Zoom call to another. But I mean, I think that's some of the things I say when we're not going back to a new normal. Some firms that thought, oh, we couldn't have workers away from our office are going to realize that, hey, it suits us to have that. We'll have less electrical bill, less this, less that. So you'll see a lot of changes, I think, in terms of how we work and what we do. But fundamentally, if we start by looking at the poorest of the poor and getting resources and money, and I think cash money and cash transfer are not creating a whole level of new program. Use the system that currently exists. I mean, in a crisis, you don't create a lot of new programs. There are too many different programs. You use a system that exists, you target it well, and you get the resources into communities, and you get them training. And we have a lot of extension training. We have a lot of all these things that we need to get back to. That knowledge hasn't been quite lost yet. It's getting ready to go. But a lot of it is still there, and it's still with some of the older farmers and stuff. We need to get them out and begin to think of strategically what are the things that we can produce in different time frames, and how can we meet if start thinking about what happens if you have export control on various things. What do you substitute? In Haiti, they have breadfruit. They do breadfruit flour. We have breadfruit trees all over Jamaica, right? So, and breadfruit flour is very good. And so also in the market, North American market, because of the gluten tolerance, a lot of the things that we have at home that we have turned our backs on because we have been incorporating another type of diet are things that we can redevelop and utilize for ourselves, and also become good export market, and which will be sustainable if we're to fill even our climate plans and our climate targets. So I think we also need to think about concurrency between natural disasters, which will come, hopefully not in any gigantic ways, and this COVID thing, which we have no idea when it will end. Hopefully soon. Hopefully we'll be able to. I'm not sure what the numbers are in Jamaica. Many places are turning down a little bit, but we'll see. But the longer it takes to open up, the longer it will be to have the rebound and the recovery. And I think the things that we traditionally count on, we can't count on them anymore. We have to count on ourselves and our intuition and our creativity and that deep well of things that have sustained people, because people have been living in poverty for quite a long time, and they have lots of tolerance and lots of skills, and so we need to help to support those and to build those.
Thank you. I want to open to questions from our other participants, but just Mikey, do you want to talk a little bit about the regional context, how Jamaica fits in? What do you see as a way forward, and whether, and I'm drawing here from the comments in the chat, whether there is a philosophical frame within which you think we should be thinking about the future, particularly given that, as part of what Hope McNish here points out, capitalism goes through boom and bust cycles as a norm. So is there something that we should be seeing differently in the way forward?
Well, I think that we need to think of development of the Caribbean people rather than Caribbean states by themselves. And that would mean that I include the diaspora in addition to the Caribbean in its broadest sense of Caribbean. I don't think it makes sense for us to think only of the English-speaking Caribbean. And those of us who are English-speaking are at a definite disadvantage. We made it out that ourselves because we have not allowed ourselves to become multilingual to be able to relate to the rest of the non-English speaking Caribbean. I mean, Haiti have more people, twice as much. Haiti, Cuba, both have twice as much people as English-speaking people in the region. So my own perspective is that we need to think of it much broader. Now, obviously, the one area is in the way in which we relate to the rest of the world as a group. And that's very important, to be able to work as a group to access the global economy, to protect ourselves, to provide mutual support. But I think that there are ways in which we can also functionally help each other. And the most important one to me is food. And I think that we in the small islands need to work very closely with the larger territories of Belize, Guyana, and Suriname to come up with a food plan. There's a CARICOM regional food plan. It probably needs to be updated to be sure. But we certainly have a lot of room for increasing our food production, displacing imports, maybe not immediately, but over time we should be able to come up with strategies to displace some of the imports, as well as to be able to service the tourist economy if and when it returns. I recall a few years ago, the US Department of Agriculture promoting among its farmers that Caribbean tourism was growing and they should gear up to feed the tourists who are going to the Caribbean. And our governments didn't do anything about that. To me, I think that that is an opportunity and it's bound to come back because we're going to be doing some tourism at some point. So certainly with regard to food, that's important. Also very important has been the way in which Cuba in particular and Jamaica to a lesser extent have been working with the rest of the region for disaster preparedness. Mm-hmm. And we are pretty good in terms of managing the impact of hazards. What we are not so good at is recovering life after the hazard has hit. And some of it has been quite shameful, the way in which we turned our back on some of those communities that got damaged the last time. And we are now in a situation of climate change where we have one sea. You know, we think of the sea as dividing us, but it really connects us. It's one sea. We need to have a collective vision of how to deal with that sea, because that sea is going to be transmitting a lot of the climate changes that hit us collectively. So that is certainly another area that we have to work together on, and at both the level of research and information, as well as coordinating assistance for each other in that regard. At the level of the knowledge economy, which is an important area, knowledge in the broadest sense of scientific knowledge, cultural knowledge, entertainment knowledge, I really think there's much more that needs to be done among and across the Caribbean, across language groups, etc., in order to build a way in which we can tap into the international markets. Again, they are down now, but certainly those markets can be serviced without people coming here, so that with the cut back in travel, but the maintenance of international communication, we can tap into those markets. Beyond that, of course, is the fact that there's just a lot of work that is available if our people are properly trained. That has its problems. How do you tax people? How do you prevent people being exploited and so on? But it is a new area. And that new area, I think, needs to be developed with a regional approach to educating our people as to how to engage with the with working over the internet. I mean, there are many examples. I don't want to hold us up with anecdotes here. Then there's the issue of natural resource management. Some of us are water surplus countries, like Jamaica. Other countries, other Caribbean countries are importing water. How can we cooperate with each other in order to address these basic fundamental issues? So I think that I really can't see a national action outside of a regional context. But one has to recognize that we are not all the same. So for example, we in Jamaica here need to push very hard for non-carbon energy sources, solar and wind and so on. In Trinidad, they are fortunate to have a lot of, and Guyana now, have petroleum resources, but even then those can finish. And so a place like Guyana, which has tremendous hydro potential, tremendous petroleum, there are ways in which we must be able to find ways, cooperation among the region, those who have resources and those who don't. So yes, I do think that we must always think in terms of a Caribbean perspective. I just wanted to be a little broader to think in terms of the development of the Caribbean people. And that way it goes across the territories themselves into where people are. That's my view on the Caribbean. Immediately is the food though. Immediately, the immediate thing is the necessary is to work on the food issues.
People have been commenting in the chat, but I want you to speak. So if by a raise of hand, you can, it's in the tools section, for those of you, you can react. Raise a hand and pose either questions or comments. We also want to hear the ideas that are present in the group. We have 83 people present, so just by way of recapping on the chat, there is a conversation here around the debate between how the young will respond to the idea of the market as opposed to solidarity building, and that could possibly be a limitation on how we move forward. There are questions about the reopening of the economy and how to do so without creating more poverty and social inequality. But I want us to, okay, so let me try to navigate this. I see people saying in reactions, there is on the participant side of your screen, usually that's on the right, or at least I'm seeing it on the right, you have the option to raise a hand. You have invite, mute me, and raise a hand.
If I may, they need to click on participants at the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
Open up that side.
So I'm seeing Alyssa, T.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, everyone. And I actually put a question in the chat, so I'll just ask it here. That was wonderful to hear you, Mikey and Mariama. And I wondered if perhaps I could ask you, particularly Mikey, to comment on a bit more on the question of the food security strategy, and specifically the issue of intra-regional trade. We had this conversation a few days ago with Deep Ford and talking about the importance of a regional food security strategy. And, I just wondered if you could offer some thoughts on the difficulties of that within the context of the single market economy, the challenges that raises for questions of protectionism, the thorny issue of intra-regional trade, particularly between Jamaica and Trinidad, and then the important point I put there, but you already sort of addressed that, which had to do with thinking about this outside of just the Anglophone Caribbean, so thinking of Caribbean Forum or thinking of CELA. But I just wondered if you could reflect on, the limits of the Common Agricultural Policy. CARDI has just come out from Trinidad with a regional food initiative post-COVID, but we're not seeing any of that in the Gleaner, the Observer, the Stabrook News. All of the responses we're seeing reflected in the newspapers in the region are at a profoundly national level. So I'm really grateful for this conversation. And I wondered if you could just reflect on some of the challenges we will face, because obviously, there was a webinar this morning. It was really interesting with 5 former presidents from Latin America run by LSE. And to a person, they all said that we will not come out of this without a regional coordinated approach. Thanks.
Are we okay taking 2 questions at a time? I just want to give more people the opportunity to speak. Mikey and Mariama?
Yeah.
Okay. So Maya Trot, Let's hear you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the session. Quick question. How do you plan right now to start organizing communities to discuss and come up with, you know, what they want and to feed that into government as we are locked down in some places still?
Part of what we want to do here actually is to possibly encourage people to coordinate, to become activists or advocates in their community to reach a state. So the sharing of information and ideas is in order to push us to think about how we can reach the state as well. I'm not sure that Mike and Mariama are on the ground in that kind of way, but we are hoping that out of this sharing, new forms of organizing can come up. But let them speak.
Yes, Alice, I'm glad to see you on Maya. I can't resolve the bureaucratic issues now within the Caribbean. I can't deal with that. That's going to take us to another level that I'm not prepared to deal with now and may distract us. What is clear though is that there is a disconnect between what happens with the heads of state and what they agree on what and the lives of the Caribbean people. So we do know, for example, that there is a lot of trade that goes on between the Caribbean, informal trade between the Caribbean countries across international boundaries. So for example, St. Lucia to Martinique, for example, was trading with the EU. And there's that informal trade. What has not developed really sufficiently, I think, is the big corporate groups engaged in cross-regional investments for food production. They have gone into tourism now, not always in very nice ways, because unfortunately they've come with some bad habits of displacing local people, either the fishermen or the communities from the beaches and so on. But at least it is a start for the big capital to go across the region. Postures of the governments, of course, with regard to encouraging that kind of cross-border investment, again, is one of the things that is tied up with, the kind of paralysis of action that comes out of regional agreements that are sanctioned by CARICOM. I don't know what the latest state with the food plan is, but I think that, certainly that is a dynamic thing that needs continuous development. As far as I know, it needs to be linked with manufacturing to move beyond just production of primary food products and exchange of primary food products in towards being basically a platform for export of exotic foods, processed foods within the region of various kinds. So to me, it has been a potential for development, which has not been tapped into, largely because of the proclivities of governments for their national restrictions on our neighbors. And this kind of petty sovereignty that our Caribbean leaders have is really been harming us. It is also true that CARICOM seems to be dead from the neck up. That is currently, its leadership is extremely weak. It has absolutely no presence whatsoever in the region. So while there are some good ideas, one doesn't have a feeling that they are trying to implement anything within the Caribbean community, which in a way goes to what Maya has asked about. How do you deal with the community? I think certainly that is one area of weakness as well. Now, with regard specifically to what, and I know I have not responded to all the nuances of your question, Alyssa. I'm not equipped to do that right now. But with regard to what Maya asked, I am not currently involved in community mobilization anymore, okay? I don't think, my own feeling is that the biggest price that we have paid for going the IMF, World Bank, IDB type of development strategy has been to sacrifice our communities. That's the biggest price to me, not the debt. I maintain that from 1977, when the IMF became active in the region, systematically they have broken down those communities. One of the things that was tried in the 1970s across the region, Jamaica, Grenada, Trinidad, Guyana, was with various kinds of problems, to be sure, but was the legitimacy of action taking place at the level of community and particularly social services. A lot of that has broken down with the promotion of individualism of one sort or another. My feeling is that this is an opportunity for us to have community meetings using this same technology here, in which technical persons at the tertiary level, at the university level, wherever they are, can participate in their own little communities and try to develop a sense of what that community, where it is, what it needs, how it can move forward, so that there is a role, it seems to me, for the technology and for those who have access to information to deal with their own little community. So for example, I am not going to go to Little London and try to mobilize Little London in Westmoreland anymore. That's not my community. I think there are enough people now from Little London. There weren't any 50 years ago. There are enough people now from all our little communities that they can take responsibility by just using the communication technology that currently exists now. And that way we'll be able to pull together the young people using their imagination. Our young people across the region have been very, very good with the technology, smartphone and all those kinds of things. There's no reason why we can't try to find ways to use it to pull them into a kind of dialogue about their community, a kind of self-realization for the community, which will also serve as self-realization for the young people as a way of stimulating a kind of national and by extension a regional renaissance of community life in the region. That's my thinking on that.
Mariama, do you want to add something, or do you want us to take additional questions?
Yeah, let's take some more questions. I see
I'm thinking Ali and Philip, sorry, Nandi. But just to, Keisha raised a question in the chat asking whether there is a sense that the pandemic has made Jamaicans, and we could add the rest of the Caribbean, because I'm sure we have lots of people here from the region, more or less receptive to the idea of economic resilience. Kimberly?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Dr. Witter, you started to comment on the question I have in my mind, which is around, like, how do we as Caribbean nations and Caribbean communities push forward really critical transformative changes and policies, thinking about food sovereignty, etc., knowing that there are still very real structural challenges in place. So you've spoken about trade, you've spoken about growth, and you started speaking about the international financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF. But so I do agree, I think having the community-based conversations and leadership is critical, and that's one level at which change could occur. But what still remains is the incredible amount of debt that countries owe to international financial institutions and foreign governments. So how do we negotiate the existence of this increasing and large numbers of debt, knowing that 60% or so of Caribbean countries currently owe more in debt compared to what they have in GDP? How do we balance that with the kind of changes that are necessary?
Nandi and Mariama, since you had been talking about the fiscal deficit question, maybe you could address Kimberly, but let's hear Nandi first and then.
Well, mine actually, it probably expands on her question a bit, because we hear a lot about, I'm from Jamaica, we hear a lot about obviously remittances and tourism being the largest contributors to our economy. And in 2008, right, Jamaica suffered and the region suffered greatly when the US went through its recession and the global recession. And it seems as if we didn't learn anything from that. And, you know, here we are again, and we're still in a very dependent position on everyone else. And the question becomes, what can we do as everyone else begins to look inward? What can we do to make sure that we are protecting ourselves from this kind of exposure moving forward? So how do we create an economy that thrives by itself? But also, when the world does become to open up, what can we put in place, or what industries can we start focusing on to be more resilient in these times?
Okay. Well, I will start with this question about economic resilience. I think that one of the terms of the debate, right, that's broadly from everywhere you get it, is this idea that we had a foundational thing called globalization, and that we didn't need to produce our food anymore. We can buy our food from XYZ's country. We exchange based on comparative advantage, and we will all, all boats will be lifted. And I think that one of the things that this COVID has shown is the fragility of all of the belief and all of the agreements underneath that. That when things get tough, countries go for themselves. In Europe, countries put up borders that have not been existent since the World War II have put up, because people will do what they need to do to protect their national interests. And so a big rethinking is about how do we protect ourselves to make sure we have our fundamental things: food, water, sanitation, work. Who are the dominant people in the economy? In Jamaica, almost 80% of employment is by MSME. Why aren't we seeing systematic processes addressing MSMEs, especially MS, the micro and small enterprise, where majority of the people are? That's how they're employed. Simply having tax credit is not enough. We need to move to give them cash buffer so that they can actually keep people working and they can actually stimulate development. We also need to think about how do we tax the digital economy, right? I haven't looked at the Jamaican economy, but right now, the big thing that most all of the countries are doing, developing countries, Argentina, India, whatever, even Singapore, is taxing the digital economy, because they're the only ones who are thriving at the moment. And so finding ways to begin to get some of the revenue that they're making from this crisis, and to move that into resilience program, into People's Resilience Fund, into People's Survival Fund. Different countries are creating various mechanisms of being able to blend domestic money with money coming from the revenue that is being derived, since you're not getting your trade revenue necessarily, but you can then derive some of that from that. And there's the oil price dividend. So we have a drop in oil. Jamaica, we import a lot, so the oil price has dropped tremendously, right? So within Jamaica and some of the countries who are net oil importers, there's scope there to get some minimal revenue from some of the bigger firms who can deal with a tax. All right, carbon tax, of course, we know have all kinds of elements. They can be regressive and so forth. But if we're addressing also climate change, then we need to also do some of that. And that gives you a little bit of fiscal buffer. And that fiscal buffer then should be used for MSME, for informal workers, for farmers, for community activation. We need to activate back our community activists, to be able to buy laptops, whatever we need to get them into communities, at one point STC was building all these community centers. I don't know if they're still existing, but to wire them up and stuff so people can begin to talk to each other. Even if they cannot meet, you can have small group meetings of 5, 10. You don't have to have massive group meetings where you can social distance and begin to think about each community, think about what it is that it needs. The same way that when communities don't get the service that they need, they can begin to protest. And they also can begin to think and strategize among themselves about what it is that they need and what the community have. We have no chance of doing climate adaptation vulnerability if we don't understand where communities are, which communities are vulnerable, how are they vulnerable, and what we need to put in each community to ensure that when there is a climate disaster or a pandemic disaster, what resources we move. And so we need to have those kinds of, as data, yes, we need to have those kinds of intelligence and data to be able to build the kind of economy we need. I mean, it's not going to be, I mean, we can't go back to real old-fashioned days, but we can do some things. We can map our communities. We can develop training programs. We have institutional frameworks still exist. We have RADA, we have all of those institutional frameworks. And we've seen, we know where there are pockets of people within communities across the Caribbean producing different kinds of organic types, food, flour, all kinds of things. So now we need to put resources into them. The things that we had bought into this logic of globalization. And now we see that this logic of globalization, one, it's itself being undermined by COVID, because part of the process of spreading of COVID on a global scale, where you have this one tiny microbe that is in fact affecting literally every country in the world. And it's been transmitted by globalization. But it's also because of capitalism and how the capitalist economy goes on that we have destroyed the immunization and the contact between nature and us to a certain level, so that we can have these pandemics. And believe me, there's more of these pandemics coming. If you look at all of the studies, they're all saying, and they're all respiratory, right? So pandemics are coming, they're out there and they're coming. So COVID is just one beginning. But we have to protect ourselves. And of course, you protect yourself physically, individually, by, of course, doing the things that the health minister have been saying since before COVID about building wellness, doing all the things that we need to do, eating properly, exercising and stuff. But we also have to build the resilience of the community. And there you need to be able to make sure that communities have access to water. If you need to put in water tank, you need to put in whatever you need to put. You need to get some seeds, you need to get whatever. We need to have those kind of reservoir, what grow in the community that is resilient to drought, to water, and so forth. Those kinds of knowledge exist, and still in some communities they still do exist. It's just that we haven't been valuing them because we're busy chasing other kinds of things that really look nice and shiny, right? But those are a mirage. And it's coming back to bite us, right? So we have to go back to some fundamental level of living and with each other, both within the nation and across the region, in the way that Mikey was suggesting. And that's it's not easy, but we're going to have to do it because the viruses are coming, the climate is coming, and we have no escape route because there's nowhere for us to go. Right? So it's a begin to lay down those hard work. So we're in the middle of COVID. It's a pause. It's a global pause. It's an economic pause. It gives those of us who are thinking and those of us who are acting chance to begin to bring out the things that we've been talking about for many years that people thought would make no sense. Neoclassical economists said, "Oh, you guys make no sense." But no, all those things are on the table. You read any of the World Bank IMF thing, you think you're reading a radical paper, right? Because the water that they've been peddling and the sugar they've been peddling have turned out to be mirage. All of these economies are fragile. Every single one of them. Switzerland, US, UK, every single one of them, right? When the crisis come, the health systems fell apart. It's all built on a whole bunch of fragilities. So it's not just us, but we have been thinking that somehow they knew. But we have to gird ourselves and begin to build from where we are. And we take the help wherever we can. I'm not saying we don't take help. I'm not saying we don't use models. There are models all over the place, right? And we work together with other countries. The debt is not going to be solved by Jamaica individually. The debt is a structural issue. It's a systemic issue. And Ecuador and other countries have been put on the agenda to a multilateral process for getting rid of the debt. And many of our countries have not been following it up because they're afraid. Well, here we are back in another debt crisis, right? So what are we afraid of now, right? So we have to tackle it and we have to link arm with other countries who are indebted to push systematically at international level for that reform and to move it forward. And whatever we can do regionally, we do, or whatever we can negotiate with the IMF and whomever we negotiate, of course. But we still have to it's a structural issue that's not going to be resolved by simply negotiating. Because you see, one hurricane and you're back in the debt again. Okay, one COVID and you're back in the debt again. Worse than before. Yeah.
Mikey, do you want to speak, or should we take
Well,
Michael?
how the timing going? How the timing going?
We only have officially 5 minutes
How you
or
want
6
to
minutes.
use it?
Heslop has a question. I think there's a discussion going on in the chat that's really important in terms of the idea of the language of resilience and the expectation that we be inordinately elastic as Caribbean people, that we should be wary of that debt itself is an abstract that is not real. That is, we buy into the system. So it would have been great if we heard, from others, because the responses are not just from Mariama and Mikey, but we can pay attention to the chat as well if we are able to. So, all right, let's hear from Michael Heslop. I think we can go over a few minutes. We started 5 minutes late, so thereabout. Unmute your yeah.
Saying that I'll keep it short in the light of the time, but essentially my main concern is this. There are great ideas from Mikey and Mariama and some of the other participants who commented about how really we should visualize a new society, not only in Jamaica, but the Caribbean. But I don't get enough commentary about the political context of that kind of transformation, because for sure, oldness is not going to mobilize the Jamaican population, and many other prime ministers in the Caribbean and governments, they are not going to mobilize their populations for this kind of people-based transformation of the society. So I would like to get some more comments about the political context of all these wonderful ideas about food security, water, the whole shebang. I would like to get some more commentary about that, because without that, who's going to mobilize the people to break these structural dependency features of our Caribbean economy? Yeah, that's it.
I think this is an interesting moment. What I am seeing in terms of every day, there is a conversation that is going on about the place that we are in. I don't know if anybody can keep up, but my hope is that I too don't have too much expectation when it comes to the state, but my hope is that these kinds of settings, as they allow for, sharing of information and ideas, would allow people to think about how they themselves can organize to bring some pressure to bear on the state. Because the fact is, in the neoliberal moment, the state is accountable to the IMF, not the people. And in rethinking, we also have to think about how the people themselves can make demands or, hold their governments accountable. Democracy is at stake, and it's very clear in the present. Well, let me leave it to the panelists.
Let me just make 2 quick points since you're out of time. I have been suggesting that we need to open up the discussion in order to get new ideas. If you want to know what my ideas are, I think we need to concentrate on strengthening the agro-industrial complex, particularly for own consumption and export, to ramp up the education system and reform it along the ways of improving critical thinking, and to increase our capacity to participate in the international economy over the internet. Those are the basic framework that I would start with if you're looking towards building a resilient economy in the region. Of course, that itself is another discussion. I just wanted people to know what I am thinking as a way for them to think of, to come up with what they're thinking. As regards a lot of the questions that come up both in the discussion here and the chat session has to do with what governments will do and will not do because of the way they are. I take that for granted. And to me, this process that I'm participating in now, if it can grow and build a momentum that articulates what people feel. People are feeling things out on the road. The question is, can we articulate it in a way that resonates with them, that they can see that it is something that they are behind? That I think will bring pressure on the existing political regimes, which will either split them up or they will line up in order to take advantage of where popular opinion is going. So I think that the issue of what the state will do with regard to debt, with regard to international trade, etc., is a way down the line from where this discussion is. But I just wanted to give you a sense that I think where we are is connected to that. It's just that we don't have time to make those kind of connections today. And it is good for those of you who are thinking about them to try to put it together. For example, why not use the technology to improve governance in the region, to increase the feedback from the population? Why not have cubicles all over the place so people can come and say what they want to say? Why not use the big screens that everybody watching Olympics on to mobilize for discussions in Half-Tree Square in Kingston, in Port of Spain, in Guyana? Why not use these big screens to participate in public discussion? So I think that the discussion leads in many directions, and I don't want us to try to, we can't answer everything now. Certainly I can't. Sorry about taking too long.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would support much of what Mikey said, but I think also one other dimension that we need to put in is the gender dimension, and we need to think about how to support communities, women, and how to support the care work that women are doing, and how to open up the black box of the family, and to make sure that we are moving resource into communities so that we have elder care taken care of, we have the children taken care of, and we have the various ways, things that are impacting how men and women live, that those are fundamental things. So I think the reorganization of society is a top-down, bottom-up process. And we have to work at the state because the state has the resources, right? They do have the resources. We might be constrained, but we still have the resources, and we choose what to do with the scarce resources that we have over control over. And so we have to work to influence them that those scarce resources that they do have control and discretion over are utilized to meet the needs of those from the bottom, to meet the needs of community infrastructure, to meet the needs of basic infrastructure for childcare, for so on, and to meet the needs of farmers so that they can be productive and be creative. And from the bottom up, we need to work with our communities however we can, even within the lockdown, because people still meet and they still talk. They can meet with social distance, you can have groups of five, and discuss what's going on in your community. What are the things that are needed to make the community more stronger in case the next hurricane, the next pandemic? What are the things we need to start thinking about fixing now, identifying them, so that we're not waiting till the next pandemic, that suddenly we're creating new programs without any data, without any things, building programs on top of programs that are not going anywhere, but that we have the experience, we have the information and the data from the granular level to be able to then put the policies to work and to be able to put the technology, the resources where they need to go at any given moment. And I think that's some of the things that's missing. I think we make policy in a vacuum, and then we try to implement policy, but if we don't have the information from the bottom up and the meso level and all the various levels of the economy, then those policies, however good the intention were, they will run out of money and they won't be able to do what they're going to do because you haven't targeted them well enough, and you haven't begun to meet the needs of communities. So I think it's a bottom-up, top-down process. Some people are going to work at the top, some are going to work at the bottom, some in the middle, and we all have to join up to have an idea of what is the whole picture the big picture. So I'm taking this part of the puzzle, you're taking that part of the puzzle. But we must have these conversations so we know how it all fits together and where we're going. So we have the vision and we have the strategies, and we may differ on some strategies and tactics, but we're moving forward and we're moving in a way. And I think this current situation, more so than the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, provides us with that possibility, because people begin to realize that there's a certain level of food security that you need, there's a certain level of water security that you need, there's a certain level of some fundamental things that you need as a country, as a region, that you need to make sure of, because push comes to shove, all the people who are telling you that this was not possible, this was not possible, they are the first one who will change the rules of the game to suit them and to take care of their national interests. And I think we have foregone those by signing on to a whole bunch of things that are not in our best interest in the long run.
I want to thank our panelists. This has been, I think very useful. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and primarily one of the things that I take from this discussion is the idea that there is no direct prescription forward, but that we have resources, that we have ideas, and that we can organize ourselves to ensure that those ideas and resources are treated appropriately by the state, because the reality is that in this moment, we have to find means of engaging the state and ensuring that the people who are most vulnerable, and in this time we are all impacted, are going to be a part of how we move forward as a Caribbean. So you're gonna see new requests for you to join our conversation in the weeks coming forward. As I said in the beginning, for those of you who missed, we're going to be focusing on education, on health and human rights, on labor rights, etc. And ultimately, one of the things we want to think about is whether we can develop a legislative agenda or policy agenda to put forward to engage the state as a way of rethinking the Caribbean and our economics. All right, so thanks again, everyone.